Alrighty, how's it going, guys? Hank here, right back at you with another video on the Big Blue Avenue YouTube channel. And of course, as I start making this video, there is big news that has just arrived out of Giants land. The big news that I'm going to be talking about in this video, the New York Giant, Dave Gettleman, has retired after 4 seasons as New York Giants general manager. His final record was 19-46. It was not very good. And of course, as we also found out a couple hours ago, the New York Giants have fired Joe Judge after 2 seasons as head coach. His record was 10-33. That wasn't too great, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in the video. But this video, we are going to be focusing on Dave Gettleman. So before I get into all this, I'd like to give you guys a friendly neighborhood reminder. Please do not forget to follow us on social media. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Big Blue Ave. And, of course, please don't forget to hit that big red button down below. Give us a like and subscribe. And, of course, do not hesitate to comment and give us your thoughts on Dave Gettleman's tenure. So, to give a little bit of background on Dave Gettleman, prior to becoming the Giants GM, he was a scout for the Buffalo Bills and the Denver Broncos. And with those teams, his teams had 5 Super Bowl appearances. He actually won a Super Bowl with the Broncos in 1997 before joining the Giants as a scout in 1998. However, after 1 season, he was promoted to Director of Player Personnel, where he served the next 14 seasons. And look, say what you want about his time as the Giants general manager, he did a good job in that department. The Giants had some really good winning seasons, made 3 Super Bowls, won 2 of them, had a hand in acquiring some key players that contributed to those Super Bowl runs. Of course, he would end up leaving the Giants in 2013 to become the general manager of the Carolina Panthers, where he wound up building a team that went all the way to the Super Bowl in 2015. They finished 15-1 in the regular season. Of course, they lost that game lost Super Bowl to the Denver Broncos, but a solid squad. But despite making the playoffs in 2017, he would be fired after that season, which, of course, would lead him to returning to his roots with the New York Giants. Now, let's talk about his time with the New York Giants in his 4 years. The 2018 season, he came obviously at the end of 2017, was made the GM, and his first notable move during that offseason was making Nate Solder the highest paid offensive lineman in the NFL, handed him a 4-year, $62 million contract. And let me say right off the bat that was a big mistake, because it was clear the Giants were trying to fix a position that was in need, that clearly was one of their biggest problems in 2017. And there were a lot of problems that team had. But to throw money at a problem, more often than not, that does not work out. And clearly Nate Solder was not as effective with the Giants as he was with the New England Patriots. But, let's talk about the other controversial move he made that offseason. Taking Saquon Barkley in the first round of the 2018 draft. Now, don't get me wrong, Saquon Barkley had a fantastic rookie season. And going into the draft, a lot of people will tell you he was absolutely talented, one of the best players coming out of college. It makes sense as to why the Giants picked him at the time. However, looking back, and this isn't necessarily just me speaking in 2020 hindsight, I look at that draft. If you asked me to do this all over again, I don't think I would have taken Saquon. And why am I saying this? Well, it's pretty simple. Because, quite frankly, the Giants needed to fix their offensive line. Getting a running back like Saquon Barkley is fine and all. The problem is, you were putting him on a team that really didn't have a line to protect him. You had a quarterback who, make no mistake, I love, don't get me wrong, but he was entering the later stages of his career. So it seemed to me, and I'm sure it seemed to a lot of people, that the Giants were trying to make one last effort to win now with Eli Manning, when clearly what they should have been doing was trying to rebuild and prepare for life after Eli Manning. So if I were to do this draft all over again, what I probably would have done, I don't think I would have taken Sam Darnold. I know he had a lot of potential going into that draft, but based on what he's done with the New York Jets and the Carolina Panthers, I don't think that would have been my guy. Josh Allen probably would have been a more 2020 hindsight pick. I think maybe instead my best bet would have been to take maybe guard Quentin Nelson, who the Indianapolis Colts would take at 6 in that draft, because as I said, offensive line was definitely one of their positions of need. And maybe could have waited another round to take my running back, and instead I probably would have used that on Nick Chubb, and I would have preferred that over Saquon Barkley because, let's face it, I like his style of running better. Nick Chubb is a true north and south runner who will run over people in his way, whereas Saquon Barkley will have one good run in there, but he dances a little bit too much for my liking, and sometimes him trying to be fancy will lose yards, and ultimately at the end of the day, I'm taking the north and south runner any day of the week. At the end of the day, Giants, despite Saquon Barkley's strong rookie season, would end up going only 5-11. And then the next offseason, some good moves. For starters, you traded Olivier Vernon and Odell Beckham Jr., neither of which I had a problem with. Vernon was an okay defensive player, but the problem was his contract was going to be an issue. Yeah, I get why you had to move on from him. Odell Beckham Jr., look, if you've seen episodes of me on Big Blue Avenue, and if you've seen my takes on Odell Beckham Jr., whether it be in years past or whether it be in a short video, you know that I'm not a big fan of Odell Beckham. And why? Well, it's simple. The guy has an attitude problem. So trading those players, I don't think were the problem. Could they have gotten a better turn for Odell Beckham Jr.? Possibly, but that's a tangent for another video. What they did get in return for those players were Jabril Peppers, Kevin Zeitler, a first and third round pick. Kevin Zeitler proved to be one of our better offensive linemen, so I'll definitely take that. And Jabril Peppers, even though he ended up missing the second half of the season with a torn ACL, he had a solid 2020, so I'm going to say that's a win, even though I think Dave Gettleman probably shouldn't have extended Odell Beckham the offseason prior. But, it is what it is. I'll call a spade. I'll call that trade a win. The biggest controversy for me was probably the first round of that NFL draft. Taking Daniel Jones at number 6 is looking like a reach. I think one could make the argument that the Giants could have taken linebacker Devin Bush, who the Steelers ended up taking at 10th, or Josh Allen, who the Jacksonville Jaguars took immediately after. And look, Josh Allen is one of the best defensive players on a horrible squad. He had 7.5 sacks last year. I think the Giants could have definitely used his production. And that's not me saying anything against Daniel Jones. I think obviously he had some moments where he looked like he's had potential, and I'm hoping that he bounces back in 2021, but it's looking like that draft could have done better. However, Daniel Jones, I don't think was necessarily the biggest mistake in that draft. They did take Dexter Lawrence with the second first round pick. That was a decent move. Dexter Lawrence has proven to be an okay Giant so far. However, afterwards, it's where it gets worse. The list of picks they took that year: DeAndre Baker, O'Shane Ximines, Julian Love, Ryan Connolly, Darius Slayton, who had a solid first few seasons, averaged around 750 yards, but had a significant drop-off in the last season. So that pick isn't looking great right now. And Corey Ballantyne. Notice that a fraction of these names that I mentioned aren't even on the Giants anymore. Corey Ballantyne is now on his third team. He played briefly with the Jets in 2020. He's now on the Detroit Lions. DeAndre Baker had legal issues that I don't really want to get into. O'Shane Ximines has had injury problems. Ryan Connolly only played 4 games, ended up getting hurt after week 4, then got cut out of training camp before the 2020 season. So that was essentially a wasted pick. So for a lot of those guys to not even have an impact on the Giants after 2019, that's a major indictment on Dave Gettleman. And not to mention, he didn't really help the offensive line. However, the one good trade that I will give Dave Gettleman for the 2019 season, right in the middle, traded for Leonard Williams. And look, at the time, that one looked bad because they did give up a first-round pick. But you know what? Leonard Williams proved to be one of our best edge rushers. They ended up extending him for good reason after a very strong 2020 season. And then you look at the end of last year, he still played pretty well despite a bad elbow. So I'm not going to flip out over Leonard Williams. However, that season, the Giants finished 4-12, ended up firing head coach Pat Shurmur after only 2 seasons. Had a combined record of, I believe it was 9-23. Totally understandable. Didn't think he was going to be a coach that lasted very long. Obviously, his days were numbered. So then we get to 2020. Giants hired Joe Judge coming into the season. He was a special teams coordinator with the New England Patriots. Had a better offseason that year with the signings of James Bradbury and Blake Martinez. And in the draft, this was obviously one of Gettleman's better drafts. Took Andrew Thomas, who was definitely the only offensive lineman that really panned out for Dave Gettleman. Took Xavier McKinney. So far, a pretty solid safety. Matt Peart hasn't had the best of luck with injuries and didn't have a great 2021 season, but in my opinion, that's because I thought he should have been getting the start instead of Nate Solder, but that's a discussion for another day. Darnay Holmes hasn't spent a lot of time last year, but I still think he has potential. Shane Lemieux and Carter Coughlin and Tay Crowder are another few who've had some solid performances, but I don't think Tay Crowder is going to be on the team much longer. But Coughlin and Lemieux, I think they might have potential. So those were okay picks. Giants ended up starting that season 1-7, and it looked like another lost season. But the second half, in retrospect, that season looked like there was a lot of progress because in the second half of the year, they finished 5-3. They had that big upset over the Seattle Seahawks in Seattle, which obviously gave people a lot of false hope. But, you know, considering the fact that they finished one game out of first place in what really was a terrible division, you could forgive Giants fans for having a little bit of hope. Not to mention, this is a team that was coming off four straight years of no playoffs and a lot of stretch of losing. Of course, they're going to feel hopeful. It looked like Joe Judge was going to turn things around. And it looked like Dave Gettleman maybe was starting to warm up among Giants fans. But then, of course, was the year that everything went downhill. Last offseason, everything he did well the year before, which was spend money wisely and draft at positions at need, went completely against him the following year. You spent money on Kenny Golladay. 4 years, $72 million for a wide receiver who had trouble staying healthy. This year, didn't even have a touchdown catch. Big problem. Signed tight end Kyle Rudolph to a 2-year, $12 million deal. Had injury problems, didn't really make much of an impact as you thought, trying to back up for Evan Ingram. So that proved to be a waste of money. And then while Adoree Jackson was an okay contract, he put the Giants in serious cap problems. And that's one reason as to why Dave Gettleman is no longer with the team and was pretty much forced to retire. So free agency was a problem. It also didn't help that they let Kevin Zeitler go, who is one of their better offensive linemen. Letting Dalvin Tomlinson go, I understand, because you knew they were not going to keep the defensive tackle, but because they had trouble stopping the run, that proved to be a big loss. Both of those losses would come back to haunt the Giants. Now, I will give him credit for this in the draft. Azeez Ojulari was by far his best pick. Set a Giants record for rookies with most sacks in a single season, although granted that's a little skewed because Lawrence Taylor technically has that record, but I'm not going to get into all that. James Robinson obviously didn't get to play all season due to injuries, but he's another guy who I think has potential, so I don't have an issue with those picks. Everything else, the later picks did not do much. And drafting Kadarius Toney in the first round, in my honest opinion, I was very iffy about that at the time. You can look back at the draft video that I did with Andy Hopper, Sam Cardona, and Tom Scavetta. I was not completely on board with that draft pick. And while he had some good flashes of brilliance this season, he missed time with an injury too, and he did not have a touchdown pass. But was that the real reason that I had a problem with using Kadarius Toney? No. The big problem was there was an offensive lineman that was available in the first round. I believe it was Slater, who I would have absolutely loved to have had. Gettleman doesn't take him. So, in other words, he failed to properly address the offensive line again. And by the time he did fix the line, it was at the time where preseason was over, and he essentially signed guys like Billy Price, Ben Bredesen, Matt Skura, all of whom turned out to be Band-Aids, neither of whom helped the Giants much. And why did this come back to haunt them? Well, it's simple. Andrew Thomas missed time with an injury. And not to mention, Nick Gates tore his ACL. I believe he tore his ACL in the second game of the season. That was a loss to Washington. So, in other words, he had 4 years to help fix an offensive line. And not one of those years did he help it. You could definitely make the case that Andrew Thomas was a good pick. Because if you look at the second half of the season when Andrew Thomas did play, he only allowed 1 sack on the season. So he has potential. But whoever the new general manager is, he definitely needs to do a better job with the offensive line. The Giants, as a result, ended up finishing 4-13. And as I said, Gettleman's final record with the Giants was 19-46. Leaves little to be desired for. And, you know, you can make the argument that the Giants are now worse off after Gettleman's gone than they were when he came in. And not to mention, the Giants chose to clean house by firing Joe Judge. And I'm going to quickly share my thoughts on firing Joe Judge. I see both sides of the argument. Tom, if you know Tom from our episodes of Big Blue Avenue, you know that Tom has been a strong advocate for keeping Joe Judge all season long. And I totally get his side of the story. Because make no mistake, you can argue that Joe Judge did a horrible job this season, and I certainly don't think he did a great job. However, a lot of what happened to Joe Judge this season were due to things that happened out of his control. Certainly wasn't his fault that a lot of players got injured. Certainly wasn't his fault that Dave Gettleman did not do a great job of building the roster. And, you know, it certainly wasn't his fault that he didn't even get to hire his own offensive coordinator. So I totally get that. With that having been said, I also understand that if the Giants were going to hire a new GM, it might help to let that GM have some input in getting a new coach. So, and with the Giants having their fifth year in a row under 500, it totally makes sense to clean house. And let's face it, the Giants have just become an absolute laughingstock over the past 5 years. They are tied with the New York Jets for worst winning percentage over the past half decade. And not only that, they have not been above 500 once. Not even early in the season, starting 1-0. So, regardless of where you stand with Joe Judge, and regardless of where you stand with Dave Gettleman, who obviously needed to go, the fact of the matter is, things need to change for the New York Giants. So, I think the ultimate question next is, who do the Giants replace Dave Gettleman with? Some names that I've been hearing are Quentin Harris from the Arizona Cardinals, Ran Carthon and Adam Peters from the 49ers, Monte Ossenfort from the Tennessee Titans, Ryan Poles of the Kansas City Chiefs, and Joe Schoen of the Buffalo Bills. I'm going to probably look more into a lot of these candidates, but from what I've heard, based off of the rumors, it seems like Monte Ossenfort of the Tennessee Titans and Joe Schoen of the Buffalo Bills are getting the most consideration. And whoever ends up getting hired, I hope they do a better job with the Giants than the previous regime. And I'm hoping they can find a way to fix the offensive line and fix the edge, because those are the positions that, in my opinion, are in major need of change. And yeah, let's face it. the Giants are a complete mess. However, the one bright spot is all of the GMs that I have mentioned are GMs that are outside the organization. If you look at the Giants' history, they have always have had a habit of hiring guys that have had ties with the Giants. As I mentioned, Dave Gettleman was the director of player personnel for many years. And make no mistake, he was a good football mind. He was a contributor to 2 of the Giants' Super Bowls. But eventually there comes a point in time where every GM and head coach has their, expiration date. And eventually there comes a point in time where the game passes great minds by. But also, not to mention, Ernie Accorsi had ties with the Giants. Jerry Reese, same thing. The only general manager the Giants have hired over the past 50 years that was outside the organization was George Young. And George Young, if you look at the history of the Giants, turned out to be the best guy for the job. Whoever the new general manager is, time will tell how they can fix the Giants, but can't make them. The Giants can't be much worse off than what Dave Gettleman left with them. Then again, I said that 4 years ago, knock on wood. But in any event, that is pretty much all I have to say regarding Dave Gettleman. Tom will come up with a vid probably shortly after with sharing his thoughts on Joe Judge. And I'm sure Tom's perspective will be a little bit different from mine. But in any event, I want to thank you guys for tuning in to another video on the Big Blue Avenue YouTube channel. I want to remind you again, you can find us on all of our forms of social media. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Big Blue Ave. And of course, if you like what you saw, you want to comment and like our videos, please don't forget to hit that red button down below. Please don't forget to hit a like and let us know in the comments. Who do you think the Giants should hire as the new GM? Do you think the Giants were right in cleaning house? That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching. As always, I'm Hank and Dichter, and I will talk to you guys on Thursday when Tom and I go live for our next episode of Big Blue Avenue. See you later, fellas.